In this video, we continue a discussion on Chapter 5, where last time we measured the price level of an economy and how it changes via the GDP deflator and inflation rate. Today, we will consider the effects of overall price changes by considering the micro-level effects of inflation in terms of the price, income, and wealth effects, from which we will discuss a key macro-level effect of inflation, from which we will move on to the causes of inflation, and conclude by defining price stability. With this in mind, beginning with some preliminaries, when developing the inflation rate, we mentioned that overall price changes could make agents worse off or better off. We now would like to turn back and examine this a bit more carefully, where we would like to consider the effects of inflation at both the micro and macro levels, where this will then set us up for discussing the causes of inflation, from which we can then conclude by tying inflation to our goal of full employment. So, to begin with our discussion, starting with our micro-level effects of inflation, we first have the price effect of inflation. Well, buyers use their income to purchase goods and services at their corresponding price points, and sellers will earn income on the goods and services that were purchased. So in terms of a transaction, depending on how prices changed, a buyer could be made better off, which will make a seller worse off. Alternatively, a buyer could be made worse off, which could potentially make a seller better off. To see this, should prices increase and buyer income remain the same, well, buyers can now purchase fewer goods and services than they could before, and they'll be made worse off as a result. While on the other hand of these transactions, sellers will now receive more income per unit on these goods and services and could potentially be made better off as a result. Alternatively, should prices decrease and buyer income remain the same, buyers can now purchase more goods and services than they could before and will be made better off as a result, whereas sellers will now receive less income per unit on a good or service and could potentially be made worse off as a result. Now, proceeding on to our second micro-level effect of inflation, we have the income effect of inflation, in which we will focus on the buyer, where the buyer uses their income to purchase these goods and services at their corresponding price points, where in this case, more often than not, both income and prices will change over time. So we should consider how income is changing with respect to overall price changes, such that if income is growing at a slower rate than inflation, then buyers can purchase fewer goods and services than they could before and will be made worse off as a result. While on the other hand, if income is growing at a faster rate than inflation, then the buyer can purchase more goods and services than they could before and will be made better off as a result. Lastly, in terms of our micro-level effects, we have something similar to the income effect, but instead the wealth effect, which considers agent assets, in which buyers and sellers may hold assets such as stocks, bonds, hold funds in a savings account, or be interested in real estate, where these different types of assets can generate them returns or can appreciate or depreciate in value, where how these returns move with respect to inflation can potentially make the agent better or worse off. Where if these assets are increasing in value slower than the rate of inflation, then agents will be made worse off as they now have the ability to purchase fewer goods or services than they could before. Whereas on the other hand, if these agents have their assets increasing in value at a faster rate than inflation, then agents will be made better off as they can now have the ability to purchase more goods and services than they could before. So now that we've seen how individual agents are affected by inflation, we now would like to consider the main macro-level effect of inflation, in that changes in the price level of an economy are expected by its agents, where if overall price changes occur at a rate different than what agents planned for, then uncertainty for future planning occurs, where here uncertainty is going to be the main macro-level effect of inflation, in that if there's uncertainty on how to plan for the future, then price is now a faulty signal, where with respect to consumers will not know the rate at which to purchase big-ticket items such as appliances, cars, houses, and things of that nature, whereas on the other hand, firms will not know at the rate at which they should expand their operations, in which these agents will have expectations on how fast prices are increasing each year, and so they can plan accordingly in terms of making these big ticket item purchases or expanding their operations. However, if there's uncertainty and in reality prices begin increasing at a faster rate than what they're expecting, then they could be made worse off. So with this uncertainty and trying not to make themselves worse off, instead of trying to adequately plan for the future, since their expectations may be wrong, consumers and firms may refrain from making these types of purchasing decisions in terms of big ticket items and expanding operation, which means a reduction in activity for the economy. So then, now that we've gone through the micro and macro level effects of inflation, a question we now might have then is, what causes inflation? Well, we're going to have two answers, and our answer will be based upon demand and supply, where with respect to demand, we'll have demand pull inflation, which is excessive pressure to buy on the demand side of the economy. And currently, we do not have a framework to think about the aggregate product market of an economy, but we can translate this idea to develop the intuition through using the product market of a single good or service as we encountered in Chapter 2. So to demonstrate demand pull inflation, here we have the product market for a single good or service. We have price on the vertical axis and we have quantity on the horizontal axis, downward sloping market demand curve, and upward sloping market supply curve. The market is in equilibrium when buyer and seller behavior is compatible with one another, which occurs at the intersection of market demand and market supply, giving us the unique quantity level as well as unique price point as well. Now, with respect to demand pull inflation, this is excessive pressure on the demand side of the economy, and this is going to correspond to a positive change in demand or a rightward shift in the market demand curve for this example. So this is going to be one of those non-price determinants of demand corresponding to a rightward shift in market demand. So we could think about this in terms of consumers getting more income, so they have more available choices to them to purchase this good or service. We could think about this in terms of increased preferences, or we could think about this in terms of more consumers entering the market. Overall, though, what will happen is there will be a change in demand in which market demand shifts to the right. We're holding price constant. With this rightward shift, the market will be put into a shorted state such that firms will respond by increasing the price on their good or service, in which there will be a change in quantity supplied and a change in quantity demanded, such that when buyer and seller behavior now becomes compatible with one another once again at the intersection of market supply 0 and market demand 1, there will be a new equilibrium in which there's a higher quantity level as well as a higher price point, where extending this to the economy level, this higher price point would correspond to an increase in the price level of the economy, in which that by definition is inflation. So having gone through the demand side cause for inflation, let us now go to the supply side reason in which inflation occurs, in which we'll have cost push inflation. And this will be excessive upward pressure on production costs, where once again we do not have the framework in place to examine the aggregate product market of an economy, but we can use our framework for a market of a single good or service to develop the intuition. Whereas before we have our market, it's an equilibrium at the intersection of market demand and market supply. And in terms of cost push inflation, this is going to correspond to a negative change in supply corresponding to a leftward shift in market supply, and this is going to be due to increased cost in terms of how the business can operate. So we can think about this in terms of an increase in factor costs, so increased wages on the employees that need to be paid, an increase in taxes that the firms have to pay to the government, a reduction in assistance from the government in terms of reduced subsidies and things of that nature. So with one of these things occurring, what will happen is there will be a leftward shift in the market supply curve. We're holding price constant. The market will be put into a shorted state such that firms will respond by increasing the price on their good or service, in which there will be a change in quantity supplied and a change in quantity demanded until buyer and seller behavior are compatible with each other once again, which occurs at the new equilibrium at market supply 1 and market demand 0. And at this new equilibrium, there's going to be a reduction in the quantity level of this good or service, and there's going to be an increase in the price point of this good or service as well. We're extending this to the economy level. If this were to be the price level, with an increase in the price level of the economy, this means by definition, inflation has occurred. Lastly, with the causes of inflation as well as its macro level effect of uncertainty in mind, what would be a suitable rate of inflation to have in an economy? Well, the answer is going to be a rate at which there is price stability, in which price stability is going to be defined as the absence of significant changes in the price level of an economy. And this is going to be such that agents in the economy's expectations on price changes will match what's going on in the economy in terms of realized price changes. And this is going to be accepted to be an inflation rate of less than 3%. So then, with price stability defined, a consequence of this is that we now have our goal of full employment fully defined as well. In that, recall that full employment is the lowest rate of unemployment compatible with price stability, in which in a previous chapter we saw that this was an unemployment rate between 4% to 6%, in which there is zero cyclical unemployment. So this unemployment rate of 4 to 6% allows for frictional, structural, and seasonal unemployment, but no cyclical unemployment. And in terms of price stability, this now means an inflation rate of less than 3%. And once again, this can correspond to our performance goal for an economy. And in terms of the government managing an economy, this is what they're going to be striving for as well. With this in mind, what we'll pick up in our next video is examining inflation data for the US.